Hello, good afternoon and good morning to the second lecture in our series Bamberger Buch-Geschichten, which is the first lecture today, which will be a workshop conducted in English about the earliest printed books produced in Bamberg in the 15th century. As you've seen, this session will be recorded and be made available online after the event. There's also a live transcription, which you can turn off if it's irritating you. And the chat function will be disabled until the end of the lecture. Then you're very welcome to ask questions. For our workshop on Albrecht Pfister and the earliest printed books from Bamberg, I'm greeting you today from this beautiful town in Franconia. Now my screen does not move. Have we moved to the second slide? Now, for our workshop on Albrecht Pfister and the earliest printed books from Bamberg, I'm greeting you today from this beautiful town in Franconia, the northernmost area of Bavaria. I am director of the Staatsbibliothek, which is housed in the Baroque building on the left, the former residence of the Prince Bishops. And you can actually imagine me and my co-host Alyssa behind one of the windows on the first floor, right above the entrance. My co-host, Alyssa Steiner, studied in Oxford, Basel and Manchester and is currently working on a project on Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools here at the University in Bamberg. Together, we will, in the next approximately 90 minutes, virtually follow in the footsteps of the first known printer who was active in Bamberg in the 1460s. Albrecht Pfister would have seen the cathedral much as it is today. It was built and consecrated in 1237. As a secretary to the bishop, Pfister would have regularly come up Cathedral Hill to the bishop's headquarters, the so-called Alte Hofhaltung, seen here on the left, which housed the chancellery and the library in the Middle Ages. From here, a short walk led to Pfister's workshop, situated in the Sonnenplätzchen, a small square next to a long building that used to be the Franciscan monastery in the 15th century. The monastery was dissolved in 1803 for the secularization. And you can just about spot the site of Pfister's house on the far right of this picture. The building has changed very little over the centuries. Let us change the perspective briefly and go back 420 years to the year 1602, when this bird's eye view of Bamberg was produced by the topographer Petrus Zweidler. Here you can see the cathedral on the top left, as we are now looking west rather than north, as in the previous picture. From Cathedral Hill, a staircase led down to what was then called Judenplatz, the former center of the Jewish quarter. If one continued along the street towards the river, the large Gothic church of the Franciscans came into view. It was demolished after the secularization of 1803. Standing in front of the church, Pfister would have taken a right-hand turn at the corner along the monastery's walls, which hit the monastery's garden, and ended up standing right in front of his own house and workshop. If he had kept going along the Franciscan church and turned left, he would have reached the town hall, which then, as it is now, was situated right in the middle of the river, as close to the bishop's area of influence as possible. The river, the Regnitz, is a tributary of the Main, and goods were loaded onto boats with a crane just behind the town hall. The Main flows westwards, passing Würzburg, which will also figure prominently today, and joining the Rhine in Mainz, where Gutenberg issued the first printed Latin Bible in 1455. If Pfister crossed one of the two bridges, he could move from the ecclesiastical center of power on the hill to the settlement of the burghers on an island between two branches of the river, whose commercial center was the market square. From there, the trade route to Nuremberg was within easy reach. Pfister's workshop thus was placed in close proximity to the church authorities who had introduced printing in Bamberg and still controlled it, and to the lay audience for which his vernacular books were primarily intended, as well as to the major routes of transport by land and water. Albrecht Pfister is of great importance in the history of early printing in Bamberg and far beyond. He used the types created by Johannes Gutenberg for his first editions, the textbooks of the Latin grammar by Donatus, and the calendar issued in late 1454, which propagated military action against the Turks who had conquered Constantinople in the preceding year, the so-called DK type. This type was used for a reprint of Gutenberg's Latin Bible, which came out in Bamberg in 1459, 1460, and must have been commissioned by the then Bishop Georg von Schaumburg, who ruled from 1459 to 1475. Albrecht Pfister, who is supposed to have printed the 36-line Bible, although there has been some controversy surrounding this question, was closely associated with the bishop's court. His name has been discovered in official documents dating from 1448. Where Pfister was described as a procurator, as an official of Georg von Schaumburg, who was then still cathedral provost and administrator for the sick bishop Martin von Liechtenstein. In 1459, Georg was elected bishop. Albrecht Pfister is referred to as a clericus conjugatus, a married cleric in this document. So he had only the lower orders. Pfister was obviously familiar with Latin and well educated. He wrote a neat and fluent chancellery hand and acted as a secretary to Bishop Georg, and he was one of the scribes in this manuscript in which the episcopal fiefs are recorded. This activity as a scribe, however, came to an abrupt halt on this page dating from November 1460. And in later entries from the year 1466, the word selig is added to Pfister's name, so he must have been dead by then. A few months after the sudden end of Pfister's scribal activities for the bishop in February 1461, the first dated book printed in Bamberg came out. The collection of German fables known as the Edelstein, compiled by a certain Ulrich Boner, which was printed in Gutenberg's DK type. The colophon gives an exact date for the printing, 1461, on St. Valentine's Day. Only one copy of this edition survives. It is kept in Wolfenbüttel. This is the first book we will see today in more detail. The Edelstein is not only a precious stone, but it is also a milestone in the history of early printing. It was the first book printed in German which was illustrated with woodcuts, a total of more than 100 of them. Albrecht Pfister's path-breaking idea was to combine the technologies of the long-established block printing and of Gutenberg's recent innovation of printing with movable type, and to employ them to produce books of German popular narrative texts. These texts offered moral instruction or knowledge of biblical history in an easily digestible manner, and were targeted at a wider audience who was able to afford and read German books. The year after the Edelstein came out, an edition of German versions of 4 histories from the Old Testament was produced. 2 copies of this book survive, one in Paris and one in Manchester, and we will see the John Rylands copy later. Here, the lengthy rhymed colophon is dated 1462, and the name Albrecht Pfister appears for the first time together with the place of printing. The date is given as 1462, not long after St. Walpurgis's Day, that is the 1st of May. After these two precisely dated editions, Pfister produced at least 7 other books, among them editions of a Bible for the poor in German and Latin, and a dialogue between the death and a peasant, the so-called Ackermann, mourning the loss of his wife, all of them illustrated with woodcuts. None of them has a colophon, and Pfister's name and the place Bamberg only appears in an undated edition of the Belial, a legal dispute between Christ and Satan, which is not illustrated, so we will leave it aside today. We do not know how many copies Pfister produced of each of these editions, but as several of them were reissued a year or two after they first came out, the print run may have been small. Today, Pfister's books count among the greatest rarities of early printing. Only a little more than 20 copies of all of his 9 editions survive, and several of them have only come down to us in a single copy. So other editions which he may have produced may very well have been lost. In this workshop, all 4 illustrated works in German issued by Pfister will be shown. We will begin with 2 editions of Boner's Edelstein, which survive in unique copies in Wolfenbüttel and Berlin. Then we will proceed to Manchester to look at a German edition of the Biblia Pauperum and one of the 2 surviving copies of the 4 histories from the Old Testament. And finally, we will examine a particularly fascinating series of leaves from Pfister's Ackermann, from a copy that left its native Franconia more than 200 years ago to see the world. This truly a detective story will be revealed by Eric White. After that, we will be shown a surviving complete copy from Wolfenbüttel. So that is our program for this afternoon. Quite an ambitious one, and I hope everything goes well, and I hope you stay with us until the very end of this workshop. But first of all, let me briefly thank my colleagues Christian Heitzmann in Wolfenbüttel, Falk Eisermann and Oliver Dunze in Berlin, Julian Simpson in Manchester, Anne van Kamp, Henrike Lehnemann and Alex Franklin in Oxford, and Eric White in Princeton for making this virtual tour possible. And last but not least, to Alyssa Steiner, who will guide us on our travels through Germany, Britain, and to the US, and tell us more about the contents and the illustrations of 4 fascinating books. So, Alyssa, over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Bettina. I'm really excited for this adventure that will take us from Germany to the UK to the US. And I'll be guiding you throughout today's session by providing a bit of literary context for each work, as well as reading out a few passages in the original German, while we'll get to have a first look at the fragments and copies before then handing over to each of the librarians to talk a bit more about the provenance of the different copies. And as Bettina said, we'll close off the session by giving you all the opportunity to ask questions or comment on things, and I'm sure you will all be very happy to answer and discuss this with you further. So yeah, within just a few years in the 1460s, Albrecht Pfister made some of the greatest contributions to early incunable printing. Most importantly, certainly by favoring vernacular texts in his publishing, but also, of course, by combining printing with movable type with woodcuts. So this makes his publications exciting to book historians, literary scholars, and art historians alike. Before diving right in, just a few more words on what we're leaving out. So as Bettina said, you won't be looking at any of the Latin texts. This leaves out, on one hand, a Biblia Pauperum, which was published alongside a German Biblia Pauperum, which we'll have a look in a few minutes. And then, of course, Jacob de Teramo's Belial. which also is the only publication of Albrecht Pfister, which doesn't include woodcuts. So that leaves a lot of open questions. Certainly, those aren't the questions that we have set out to answer today, but yeah, lots of exciting things to think about in the future. As set out by Bettina, we'll take a roughly chronological approach to Pfister's oeuvre, but moving between different editions at times. So we'll start with the Edelstein, Ulrich Boner's Edelstein. Earlier research had thought that Johannes von Teppel's early humanist dialogue, the Ackermann, was the first publication of the Pfister workshop, but new research has reshuffled the timeline, and we now place Ulrich Boner's Edelstein, printed, as we know, because of the colophon in 1461, at the beginning of Pfister's printing output here in Bamberg. So the Edelstein comprises Ulrich Boner's mid-14th century Middle High German fable collection, which is mainly based on Latin fables by the 12th century anonymous novelty and the Roman poet Avian. It's considered the first coherent, explicitly authorized collection of fables in German literature, and the apex of the manuscript production was reached in the second third of the 15th century, so it coincides right with Pfister's Bamberg printing workshop. In the prologue of the Edelstein, Ulrich Boner, the author, self-assuredly outlines his rationale behind providing a vernacular text version of the fables, dedicating his collection to the Spruch poet Johann von Rinkenberg. Pfister, however, transmits a version of the text which leaves out most of these paratextual thresholds, if we speak English in it. And this is where I'd ask our colleagues in Wolfenbüttel to start showing us their copy of the Edelstein, as I'll be talking you through a few of the exciting features. Great. Great. So this is the only existing copy of this first edition of the Edelstein. It's currently held at the Herzog August Library in Wolfenbüttel. And as we can see, quite typically for early incunables, there is no title page, nor a mention of Ulrich Boner. We start right on the very first fable. So the Pfister Edelstein contains 86 fables, so less fables than in some of the manuscript, transmitted manuscripts. As a rule, every fable is headed by a woodcut, which together with the initial, as we can see quite nicely here, marks the beginning of a new fable. Typically, the woodcut reflects the content of the fable. So in this case here, we have the fable of the monkey and the nuts. We can see an inexperienced monkey chewing on a nut with a very hard nutshell. The monkey loses its patience and spits out the nut without ever getting to its delicious kernel. The text then likens the monkey to those who, because of a short period of bitterkeit, so bitterness, forsake long Süßigkeit, sweetness, or salvation. The moral teachings in the fables are matched by a curious figure depicted in a separate image pane next to the monkey scene, as we can see here. While there is a tradition of illustrated manuscripts of the fables, none of them feature this figure. Michael Giesecke reads this as a material trace of the previously oral transmission of literature. And while the transition from oral to literal modes of transmission and the shift towards printing with movable type don't necessarily coincide, the figure's raised hand which, as you can see, is disproportionate to its face. So the hand is really highlighted, implies a speech act. And the figure's typical late medieval scholar's outfit certainly matches a supposed use of an edition like this in a didactic setting. Before handing it over to the librarian, I quickly want to highlight one more woodcut at the very end of this fable collection. Yeah, great, thank you. Because this breaks with the general rule of one image per fable. So what we can see here is a woodcut very similar to many contemporary author miniatures of Aesop, and in the few lines of the epilogue, which Pfister does transmit, an authorial speaker describes writing the book. While much of the manuscript tradition assigns these words to Ulrich Boner, here in the Pfister edition, because it's right under the woodcut, these lines are seemingly ascribed to Aesop, depicted here sitting with a book in his arms. This will be really interesting as we get to have a look at the second edition. But first, I want to hand over to Christian Heitzmann to tell us a bit more about the provenance of this Wolfenbüttel copy.
Thank you, Alyssa. I just want to say a few sentences about the history of our copy, which indeed contains 3 works by Albrecht Pfister, not only Boner's Edelstein, but also the Ackermann von Böhmen and a Biblia Pauperum. And the copy is unique for the Edelstein, and it was acquired by the founder of the Wolfenbüttel Library, Herzog August, in the 17th century. Indeed, the first mention of this copy comes from Nuremberg, made by Johann Saubert, Protestant pastor and librarian of the city of Nuremberg, in 1643, when he wrote the first book about incunabula and made the first catalogue of incunabula ever printed. And he mentions, obviously, this copy, but speaks about it as if it were a block book and not a book printed with letters. Saubert mentioned this book, and another important person in Nuremberg, Georg Forstenhäuser, was active as an agent of Herzog August in acquiring books. And Forstenhäuser obviously managed to transfer this unique book from Nuremberg to Wolfenbüttel, where it entered the collection in 1652, when an entry was made in August's Bücherrat-Katalog, a handwritten catalog in 6 large volumes with entries about all the books August bought during his lifetime. So these 3 works by Albrecht Pfister are in Wolfenbüttel since 1652 at least, and they were already famous in the 18th century when several persons mentioned especially Boner's Edelstein as the first illustrated printed book in their works. So as it was a very famous book, it became a part of a small collection that was transferred to Paris in 1807 when French commissioners came to Wolfenbüttel and picked out more than 200 precious books to be brought to Paris into the Imperial Library for Napoleon. There, the old binding, a parchment binding, was taken away, and a beautiful Morocco binding was made. Gilt edging was done, and the book was cut. So it became a little bit smaller than it was before. In 1815, however, it was restituted to Wolfenbüttel, And then again, one of the most precious books shown here for visitors of the library. A first facsimile edition of the Ackermann was made in 1919, and about 1970, the Paris binding was taken away in order to make the facsimile edition of Boner's Edelstein, which was published in 1972. Today, the three parts are no longer bound together, but every part is its own unity. So we have now 3 volumes under the shelf mark Herzog August gave to this collection of 3 Pfister prints, which is 16.1 Etica folio. So you can find Boner's Edelstein also digitized in the Wolfenbüttel Digital Library online. You have the facsimile edition, and you have now here the original under the camera. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for this fascinating insight into the provenance of this really unique book, which leads me to the second edition we're going to look at right now, its sibling, so to speak. So we're going to move to Berlin now, and great, here we are already. So this, I'll hand over to Frau Geisermann in a bit, but just for now, this is the copy currently held at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. The Gesamtkatalog der Wiedendrucke dates this at 1462. However, considering the workshop's other outputs, Sabine Hausermann suggests 1463, 1464 as a more likely dating. Overall, this edition is very similar to the first edition. There are, however, a couple of notable differences. Maybe as we open the book, if you could go back just a couple of pages, we can see that a scribe has added an inscription at the very beginning, exactly, which reads, there you are. Aesopus hat das Buch-Gedicht, viel Weiser rät darin Bericht. So Aesop has composed this book, much wisdom it recounts. Because as with the first edition, we of course do not have a title page here. So this gives a first insight into what this book is about. So once again, as we leaf through to the fable with the monkey and the nuts, we see the woodcut. And then right underneath it, great, the first notable change is that this edition actually adds titles. So here, this fable is titled Von geistlichem Leben. So not the fable of the monkey and the nuts, but of the fable of spiritual life, highlighting the moral content of the fable. Another immediately noticeable difference is, of course, the figure standing right next to the monkeys, which has been replaced as compared to the Wolfenbüttel edition, which we can actually still see in a thumbnail. You might be able to spot the difference. So the second edition replaces the one singular figure in the first edition with a cohort of 3 scholars, which are placed alternately next to the fable woodcuts. So as we leaf through, you can see these different ones. This one is particularly notable on the left side because he's also holding a book in his hands. Once again, all of them have the characteristic manus loquens, so the talking hand indicating speech. Additionally, they also have scrolls or speech bubbles next to their heads. This All of this is especially interesting as when we go to the very back of the book once again to look at the epilogue, we notice, exactly here we are, we notice that the Aesop woodcut is missing in the second edition. So instead, all of Aesop's scholarly attributes, which we had seen in the first edition, have now shifted into these newly made woodcuts. So most notably, certainly the book and the scrolls. Exactly. But now I'll hand over to Falk Eisermann to tell us a bit more about the provenance of this copy.
Yes, thank you, Alyssa. I can be really brief here because unfortunately there's not too much provenance information. I was listening very closely to what Christian said, and the first we know really is that this book turned up or was first seen in the Paris book trade in 1835. And from there, it was bought by the really famous Franz Xaver Stöger, a Munich auctioneer, famous especially for his Stöger Passion, one of the other early printed German books, bought in 1837. And then a couple of years later, only in 1845, it was acquired by what was then the Berlin Royal Library for a considerable amount of 1,000 thaler. And that's about it, really. I mean, you see the Morocco 18th, 19th century binding would have been interesting to compare with others of this kind, but I think it's very generic and so on. But there's this silk green, which might indicate something about provenances, but then not much to see really, except the Berlin shelf mark here and an older shelf mark there. And then we start with this, what's probably was written here by the very first owner around 1500 or so, but unfortunately he didn't leave his name. And so that's really, unfortunately, what we can say about this book. It has also been digitized, and everybody is, of course, cordially invited to look for further traces. The dating, as you said, is still a little bit under discussion, probably a bit later than the GW originally thought. So, but yeah, we'll not make a great deal of that. 1462, 63, 64, something about that. And we're looking forward to hearing more results from people's studies about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sure the discussion will leave more room to discuss questions of provenance and dating. For now, we're moving on to the Bibliotheksdirektorin. So as we've seen with the Edelstein, Pfister is certainly very much interested in combining text and image, and the Bibliotheksdirektorin as an established text or bimedial creation certainly found its way to the Pfister workshop quite easily. Albrecht Pfister published 3 editions overall, 2 German and 1 Latin. And we'll be looking at the very first edition, which is dated at circa 1462, which takes us to Manchester for the very first time today. If I could ask Julianne to... Exactly, great, thank you so much. So yeah. The copy we're looking at right now is currently kept at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. And if you could just open up the book and leaf through it, exactly, that'd be great. So traditionally with the Bibliotheksdirektorin, though there are variations in the layout, each leaf opposes 1 scene from the New Testament with 2 scenes from the Old Testament in order to highlight the typological correspondence. So I've chosen leaf 31 to just show you in a bit more detail how that might look exactly. So here you're on the right side. So this leaf juxtaposes the burial of Jesus with the story of the plot against Joseph, as well as the story of Jonah and the whale, and which you can see quite clearly in the woodcuts. And then underneath the woodcuts, we have 2 paragraphs, and each paragraph corresponds to one of the 2 woodcuts right above it. So I'll be reading out the first paragraph if you want to follow along, and then I'll quickly paraphrase what it's saying. So, wir lesen in dem Buch der Schöpfung, dass die Brüder Josef durch ihn verkauften, den Ismaeliten. Dort zogen sie ihm aus sein Rock und ließen ihn in die Zistern. Josef bedeutet Christus, der dort gelassen ward in die Zistern. Das ist in das Grab dort sein Freund abnahmen von dem Kreuz. So we read in the book of creation that Joseph's brothers, when they sold him to the Ismaelites, took off his garb and threw him into the cistern. And then Joseph stands for Christ, and he was put into the cistern, which is the grave. His friends, Jesus's friends, put him in after taking him down from the cross. The layout is then completed by the prophets David, Isaiah, Solomon, Jacob, next to the New Testament scene, as well as short excerpts for each of the prophets on the very top. And basically all of the pages are laid out in this way. Maybe most strikingly, if we compare Pfister's Bibliotheksdirektorin to contemporary Bibliotheksdirektorin in manuscripts and block books, we can see that it leaves out the architectural features, which are very common. This could be just a creative preference, but it could also be just related to the space required for printing with movable type. So I'll now be handing over to Julianne Simpson in Manchester to tell us a bit more about this copy.
Okay, I'll leave the copy here and talk at the same time so you can see the detail of it. So this is the binding, and this and the next book that we're going to see, both part of the Spencer collection, which came to the John Rylands, was purchased by Mrs. Rylands when she was establishing the library in the 1890s. And she purchased the Spencer Library in 1892 from the 5th Earl Spencer, but it was actually his grandfather, the 2nd Earl, who built the library, gathered the collection in the late 18th and early 19th century. It's one of just a few collections from that date which have survived nearly intact. I think another near contemporary example is the King's Library at the British Library of George III. Also at the British Library, the collection of Thomas Granville, a close friend of Spencer, in fact, and competitor in the market, as it were. So Spencer started his collecting in his early 30s after studying at Cambridge. He was interested in the classics in particular, and that was his initial focus for collecting. From around 1788, 1789, he started in earnest building this collection, and his first focus was on first printed editions, particularly of classical authors. And these books actually represent probably one of his first forays into vernacular languages and expanding into other examples of early German printing. So the collection was in part built by using agents in London, but in addition, he had a wide correspondence and network across Europe, which enabled him to be, I suppose, first on the list for those who were starting to, in this period, and Eric's going to say a bit more about this, target particularly aristocratic collectors with these books that were becoming available especially from German monastic libraries in the late 18th century. The book itself, the two that we're going to look at were originally together, part of a Sammelband, which was discovered in Würzburg in the Carmelite monastery in 1792 by Alexander Schmotzer. It consisted of this German Bibliotheksdirektorin and also the Wehrhistorien, which we're going to look at in a minute, and at least 7 Ackermann leaves, which Eric is going to talk about a little bit later. In August 1797, Jean-Baptiste Montgerard from Erfurt sent the volume to the London bookseller James Edwards, anticipating that Spencer would acquire it. Though at the time he only wanted the Wehrhistorien from the volume as it was dated. So this was his first priority. It was Edwards who commissioned the breaking up of the volume and the remounting of the leaves. So if I just open it again, you should be able to see, particularly, zoom in a little bit, that the leaves have been remounted using potentially paper from either that period or slightly earlier. We can see a number in the top right corner here, and these numbers reappear in several of the volumes, but in a fairly random arrangement. So there's another one there, which is in 350. So presumably, or potentially having used perhaps an account book or something that had blank leaves in it, but had been foliated, using that for the remounting. But we can also, I think it was on the one we were looking at, in some cases, zoom in a little bit further, we can also see some running titles at the top as well, where if this was some leaves, perhaps from an imperfect printed volume that were cut out and used, the margins were used to remount this. So this is very typical of Spencer's bindings at this period. Somewhat confusingly, when the books arrived at the Rylands, the JR monogram was added whenever there was space on the binding. And this does confuse people today, but it is as part of the Spencer acquisition. It has a very few other identifying features associated with Spencer. When it came to the Rylands Library, this small leather book label was added inside. The only other really identifying feature is the accession number. And this gives us also some rough information about the date when books entered the collection. Down again, so in this case, we've got 9402 on there. And thanks to work that's been done, particularly by Eric in the last few years, also looking at the Spencer family papers, which are deposited at the British Library, which include an extensive collection of book bills of acquisitions by Spencer. On the 2nd of January 1798, an invoice to Edwards, mounting and binding of the Pfister, £5 5s. So that's the Bibliotheksdirektorin, and this is the Wehrhistorien, which, as I say, the two were previously bound together and then broken up in 1797, 1798 by Edwards for Spencer. So two slightly different bindings as well in this case, a little bit more gold on this one than the other. But again, the same provenance marks, the leather label and the accession number 9375 in the corner. And also the same evidence of remounting of the leaves, and also rather confusingly two separate, more modern foliations. So I can get that close enough. Might, yeah. There, at some point these separate, so they're both 13, but as we go further on, someone made a mistake. That one there from the start here. So this one, 30 in that corner and then 31 at the top. So I can hand back to you, Alyssa, to talk about the text of the Beer Historian.
Great, thank you so much. You've already nicely led us to the Beer Historian. This is an especially exciting product of the Pfister workshop because compared to the Edelstein or the Bibliotheksdirektorin, which both have precursors in manuscripts or block books, this really is an original of the Pfister workshop. So it's a book that compiles the stories of Joseph, Daniel, Judith, and Esther from a pool of vernacular retellings of biblical stories known as the Historien Bibel. Once again, the edition is richly illustrated, as we've already seen. On 115 pages of text, there are 61 woodcuts. Each of the 4 stories starts with a woodcut and a title, as we can see here really nicely. So this is the first story of Joseph. Hier hebt sich an die Historie von Joseph. So here begins the story of Joseph. In this woodcut, we can see quite nicely how on one hand there's Joseph's stream of grain, and then on the other side we can see Joseph telling his father about the stream. Before coming to the famous end poem, it's my pleasure to very briefly hand over to Henrike Lehnemann in Oxford, who has worked extensively on the Beer Historian and who will tell us a bit more about how Pfister compiled the text and how he combined it with the woodcuts. So over to you, Henrike.
Thank you, Alyssa, and it's really exciting to see all this coming together. Julian, could you perhaps turn exactly to the point where you pointed to the troubling difference in numbering? And the explanation for that is that there was originally an empty page between the end of Daniel and the start of Judith. And when it was remounted, this was cut out. So the number 31 was actually entered when there was still the empty leaf. And then the renumbering was done when this wasn't any longer there, so that this became 30. And that points to the fact, the claim to fame of this book that Alyssa already mentioned, that this is a print-born book. And Pfister took the text but rearranged it in a way that it would form 4 separate print units. Each of the historian consists of 2 quires. The first quire, always a quinternio, 10 folios, 20 pages, and then the second quire being shorter. And the Historia of Daniel would have ended just at the start of another double leaf, while Judith also would have overshot by 1 page. So he rearranged the text and took the first chapter of Judith, which fortunately mentions Nebuchadnezzar, so as the King Nabucodonosor in the Vulgate, which also features in Daniel. And so he just tagged on the first chapter of Judith to the end of Daniel. If you go 1 page back, you'll see the end of Daniel ends on the right hand side. Stay like that. So you see danach starb Daniel und kam nicht heim, and then you see 2/3 down the page Arphaxad, the name of the opponent of Nebuchadnezzar, and that should be the start of the book of Judith, which is here just following on to be able to have these nice distinct units of printing. The other way in which Pfister made it print ready was that he arranged woodcuts to form double spreads. And that's pretty much the first time that this has been done. So if you could turn please to folio 40 or 41. Perfect, thank you, exactly. So which would have been the start of quire F, so the second quire of the Historia of Judith. And there you see 2 woodcuts which have been arranged across the double spread to form something like a theater stage. So you have if you have in a medieval theater the different loca, you have on the far right hand side the city of Betulia, from which Judith originally came, and on the far left hand side you have the tent of Holofernes, and they frame the stage on which the drama is acted out. So you have it slightly confusing that you have the bloody corpse of Holofernes in the lying in the tent, while right next to it he is still having a merry feast with Judith at the table. And so this woodcut was arranged so to form this double spread, but also to be used twice. If you turn back 1 page, please, Julianne, you see the same woodcut, which is used first to tell the story of the feasting, and then on the next page to tell the story of the beheading and how the head is brought back to Betulia. And so you can watch Judith really move across the stage with the head on the right hand side and the body on the left hand side. And even though the stories itself might have not been considered that exciting and new, the way in which they are presented is really in a way the first graphic novel of German printing history. Over to you, back, Alyssa.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the Ackermann, there's one last highlight in the Vier Historien, namely the Erfolg, the colophon, the famous end poem, which I'd quite like to read out to you. Exactly, so you can see it on the very last paragraph. Ein edlich Mensch von Herzen gehrt, dass wer weiß und wohlgelehrt, an Meister und Schrift das nicht mag sein, so kun wie all auch mit Latein. Darauf han ich ein Teil gedacht und 4 Historie zusammenbracht. Josef, Daniel und auch Judith und Hester, auch mit gutem Sitt. Die 4 hätt Gott in seiner Hut, als noch jeden Guten tut. Dadurch wird bessern unser Leben, dem Buchlein ist sein End gegeben, zu Bamberg in derselben Stadt, das Albrecht Pfister gedrucket hat. Doman zahlt 1400 Jahr, im 62. Das ist wahr, nicht lang, nach St. Walpurgentag, die uns wohl Gnad erberben mag. Und Fried und das ewig Leben, das wolle uns Gott allen geben. Amen. So this end poem is notable for a few different reasons. So firstly, here history starts off by explaining that not everyone speaks Latin or understands Latin, reads Latin. Therefore, it's important to transmit the text in the vernacular as well. Then he moves on to explain how he compiled the 4 stories in order for all of the readers to better themselves. And then we come to the colophon, which Bettina highlighted at the very beginning, which includes both Albrecht Pfister's name, the place of printing, so Bamberg, as well as the date of printing. And quite excitingly, in the line, so das Albrecht Pfister gedrucket hat, we also get the first mention of the word drucken, so printing, in relation to printing with movable type. So quite an exciting end poem overall. Now, looking at the time, we're going to move to the Ackermann, Johannes von Teppel's Ackermann, which is going to conclude today's session. And this certainly is another highlight. The Ackermann was first published by Pfister in 1463, and it's basically a dialogue between a recently widowed Ackermann and death personified. And it's probably one of the most boundary-pushing works of German literature in the late Middle Ages and / early modern times. So I'll just highlight a few really striking passages before handing over to Eric White. So the Ackermann, having just lost his wife Margaret, confronts death. Grimmiger Tilger aller Land, schädlicher Ächter aller Welte, freisamer Mörder aller Leute, ihr Tod, euch sei verfluchet. So, grim destroyer of all lands, injurious ostracizer of the entire world, gruesome murderer of all people, you death, you shall be damned. And the widowers' agonized accusations certainly have lost nothing of their striking emotiveness. We read, you have brutally taken the 12th letter in my alphabet, referring to M for Margaret. Refuge of my love, you have weeded out the beautiful summer flowers of my happiness in my heart's village green. The anchor of my salvation, you have deviously taken my chosen turtle dove. So quite striking words here. Pfister's woodcuts match the text in their complexity and originality, and we'll close off this session by having a closer look at some of them. But before coming to that, I'll now hand over to Eric White at the Princeton University Library, who has done some detective work on different fragments of the Ackermann, and he'll talk us through a number of them and thereby take us from Germany to England to the US before you're coming back to Bamberg. Eric. You're still muted.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And I just want to thank you and Bettina again for putting all this together. And now I'll get my slideshow going. And I hope you see the Manchester binding and my title. Is that correct? All right. Yeah, there are 3 copies of this edition of the Ackermann. A fragile one in Wolfenbüttel, one in Paris, still in a Sammelband, and this third one, which just survives differently. It has been treated differently by its 18th century discoverers and its 19th century owners. It survives in 11 leaves in various institutions. And I'll introduce this copy as represented by these leaves. And yes, there is from Wolfenbüttel, if you look in the smaller views. As Julian mentioned from Manchester, this was part of a Sammelband discovered at the Carmelites of St. Barbara in Würzburg in 1792. Alexander Schmutzer, a cleric in Bamberg, noticed the titles, mentioned them in an early letter, and they entered the bibliographical literature and caught the attention of these book agents that were retrieving books when possible from monastic libraries, such as Jean-Baptiste Maugerard, also the Benedictine Alexander Horn. These individuals were sending letters back and forth to collectors such as Second Earl Spencer, promising to be able to retrieve these books, send them to London, etc. Spencer really wanted the Edelstein. He wanted another copy of this 1461 dated book to show up. That never happened. And so when this Sammelband of the Vier Historien, the German Bibliopauperum, and parts of a mysterious book they didn't exactly know what to call, with woodcuts, which turns out to be the Ackermann, when that became available, he just wanted the Vier Historien. It had a date in it, and Maugerard was hesitant to break it up, sent it to London intact to the bookseller James Edwards, who it really appears is the breaker of the Sammelband. Lord Spencer got the Vier Historien remounted, as you see, as well as the German Bibliopauperum, remounted in paper with these red margins. Below this, I'm showing just part of one of the letters from Maugerard, mentioning that he has the Historia Joseph, Daniele, Judith, and Esther, 65 folios. That's not true. It's 58, I believe. He's counting 7 more than it should. And those are the 7 Ackermann leaves that were bound with it, I believe. And he gets the rest of the information right and mentions the Bibliopauperum as well as available. And this is in 1797. By the end of that year, the books were in London. This is just a quick view of Würzburg and the location of the Carmelite monastery there by the bridge in Würzburg. And quickly, yeah, I'm restating the provenance from Würzburg to Edwards. And Edwards then dispersed those 7 odd leaves from the Ackermann, perhaps for sale, perhaps also as gifts, because the recipients were a very small circle of English collectors. His crowd, the people he sold books to, and he inscribed them. This is a view of the book, or excuse me, the leaf now in Canterbury, and that is Edwards' handwriting at the bottom, and in pencil it actually says James Edwards Pall Mall. So the leaves are being inscribed as specimens of Pfister's printing, and either sold or perhaps even given just as printing specimens. Here's a nice little census of what we have. Folio 17 is at Canterbury Cathedral. Folio 18 at the Ashmolean in Oxford, Francis Dowse, one of these, incunable collectors, early recipients of it. Folio 19 is at the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana. I believe its first owner was Mark Masterman Sykes. It then became part of an album of Monumenta Typographica, 30 early printed leaves, including a Gutenberg Bible leaf, 1457 Psalter leaf, block book leaves that traveled together through the 19th century. Then here a list of its owners. This album became known as the Gage Tuvey Slade album. And those are great names in British collecting. Finally, in 1911, Quaritch had it. I don't know where it went next. It seems to come from a context that might include E.P. Goldschmidt and is then sold by H.B. Krause in 1954 to George Poole and given to the library at Bloomington, Indiana University's Lilly Library in 1958. So we'll look at that. Princeton University has the next leaf, folio 20. It was long missing from any kind of documentation. Dr. Bent Jewel Jensen, Oxford, really found it among a sort of odd lot of pamphlets in the 1970s. He wrote in pencil in the binding of this object, which I have here. He wrote that he just found it, and it was sort of a black tulip among incunables. That means, a very rare find, if not the Holy Grail, more like just something you really didn't expect. This was sold through the Quaritch firm to Bill Scheide and is now at Princeton. Folios 21 and 22 have been at Manchester since 1892, as Julian mentioned, the provenance of the Earl of Spencer. He had these two leaves, one of which was with a woodcut, one of which was simply text, and I believe the woodcut is the one bound in with the Latin Biblia Pauperum. 4 leaves are from this edition, and in previous literature have not been associated with this group that went to England. It's because they were discovered in Bamberg in 1815 by Schmutzer. I should say sometime before 1815. I'm not sure of the date. He died in 1815. They're found in a Bamberg context, not in a London context. But I think, as we'll see, they're coming from the same copy, and that creates a little bit of a puzzle. Those are leaves 14, 15, 16, and 23. And then finally, the last leaf of the book is at Austin, at the Ransom Research Center in Austin, Texas. And it came from another one of these great incunable collection of the time, Sir George Shuckburgh, and stayed in that family, really hidden from literature until 1982, and was acquired by the University of Texas. Let's take a look at them very quickly. Here are the 4 Bamberg leaves, which have been digitized, and I think will be available for much closer study. They are cut down. They do not have the red outlines. The red outlines of the mounted paper, that was added in London. These were never in London. But the survival of 4 leaves that intersect perfectly with the other 7 leaves numerically is against all odds, for one thing. And there are other points of evidence that say these are from the same copy, such as the rubrication. It's not really surprising that Pfister Drucker would be rubricated by the same hand, but in each case I'm comparing details of things in Bamberg and details of things that went to London. And from the rubrication to the manuscript catchwords to the chapter numeration at the upper right, these things are common throughout what I believe is the copy. In the case of Manchester, we're looking at the Fear Historian, and on with the woodcut there. I think that's of the Holofernes page. And then one of the Manchester leaf, which was in London, versus the Bamberg example. So it's really looking to me like it's all from the same copy. I have perhaps darkened these too much in the hopes of making the watermarks show through. These are two of the Bamberg leaves, and you can see that we have two varieties of bull's head watermarks. This also matters. In the collation of this quire, the last quire of the book, we're finding that the London and the Bamberg leaves complement each other, never contradict each other in the presence or absence of a watermark. And on to the Canterbury leaf, number 17. We don't know the earliest owners. David Shaw has very reasonably and convincingly suggested William Howley, Archbishop of Canterbury, a collector of the time, and then through him to Benjamin Harrison, Canon of Canterbury, whose widow left a great library to the cathedral in 1887. That's the probable provenance. In Oxford, at the Ashmolean, Francis Dowse's leaf, obviously he was very interested in the woodcut, and you see here the verso of that leaf as well. I think for bibliographical purposes, we want to note that the broken London copy and the Wolfenbüttel copy show the same woodcut with very much the same pigmentation, the same hand coloring. I think the colors look a little different in the two images I'm showing, but the same pattern of workmanship and the same choice of colors. I think the only deviation is that we have one green stocking versus a brown one. So this would indicate serial hand coloring of copies before they were dispersed and sold. And the latest news from Oxford, a very good image of the watermark. Difficult to find when there's so much type and woodcut and semi-opaque pigment on the piece of paper. But over on the right there, you can see the bull's head and the very tall cross rising from the head. Again, verifying where watermarks are versus where they aren't helps us recreate the quire, and we'll return to that point. Leaf 19, this is the one with the very long provenance belonging to that album of early printed leaves, Mark Masterman Sykes, all the way through to Quaritch and then H.B. Krause. Here is the Princeton leaf, which I have here on the table. I think it's just easier to sort of show it here in the PowerPoint. Julianne brought up the point of the mounting paper. It is now appearing, it is incunable paper. There is that printed heading at the top and just traces of the text itself. Here on the left, I'm showing part of that, well, the headline at the top, and then this left margin of incunable type. So Edwards was using some used incunable, incomplete incunable to mount the Pfister leaves. And a shot of the watermark here in Princeton. Perhaps if we look really closely at the other volumes in Manchester, we'll catch more, or the scattered leaves, we'll find more evidence of the incunable, and we can put together what that is. I don't have a spare 20 minutes right now. Here is then the Manchester leaves, 21 and 22, owned by Earl Spencer, again, inscribed by the seller, James Edwards. Manchester has provided a very good watermark image as well. Thank you. So material gains for this symposium and its run-up. There's Lord Spencer and my very poor camera phone shot I did during a visit of the woodcut leaf there in Manchester. Moving on, I think I've reached, because we talked about Bamberg, I've reached the last leaf. This one's the one in Austin, Texas, from the long hidden collection of Sir George Shuckburgh. and his descendants, many generations. And this is an important leaf in Austin. At the end of the Ackermann is one of these little catchword phrases. And you see at the very bottom there, it says, "He hebt sich an." And that is the incipit of the Vier Historien. And so we have a very good clue about the binding order of the Sammelband. First the Ackermann, and then the Vier Historien. And I have not worked out where the Bibliothek belonged, but this is ongoing work. That final quire, we now have all the data. Each leaf has been examined and verified, and I believe this is the structure of the last quire, the survival of copy 3 of the Ackermann. These conjugate leaves in each case have one bull's head watermark and a conjugate without, which is proper to the construction of a quire. And I think this is also a final proof that Bamberg and Edwards' leaves are from the same copy. And I will stop sharing that. And that's what I have for the that particular Ackermann. So Alyssa, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really interesting. And I think we might as well just very briefly go to the few fragments we have on the visualizers. So maybe starting in Bamberg with folio 14, 15, 16, and 23. Yeah.
Yes, so we've come back full circle to Bamberg, and I can show you the 4 leaves, which are in an early 19th century binding today. This binding was probably made shortly after the library was founded in 1803, because Schmötzer, Alexander Schmötzer, who was mentioned before, was one of the first librarians. There was actually a group of 3 people responsible for the library when it was founded after the secularization of the monasteries, and 2 of them were former monks. Schmötzer was a Capuchin monk, and Jeck, the first full-term, long-term librarian, was a Cistercian. And as you've heard before, Schmötzer went to Würzburg and discovered the volume with the Ackermann leaves there. And we've actually got in the library archives a letter he sent to yet another monk, a Benedictine in the monastery of Banz nearby, where he mentions the discovery. That's the source of the identification which Eric has been talking about. He describes going to the library in July 1792, and he found a volume consisting of the 4 histories printed in missal letters in 1462, with 2 or 3 other works in the same volume. One of them the Belial, and one a work about death, which, as Eric has said, must be the Ackermann. So 1792 in Würzburg, those leaves were discovered, and I assume that Schmötzer got one of them as a typographical sample from the librarian there, Bonifatius Seufert, who was a Carmelite in Würzburg, but he was also in the Bamberg Carmelite monastery, and he actually wrote a catalogue of the incunables in Bamberg before he went to Würzburg, so they were clearly linked with these joint interests in early typography. So the fate of the Bamberg copy has been revealed. Unfortunately, we have only these few leaves and a few leaves from the 36-line Bible here, but no other Pfister prints, so it was wonderful to see them all virtually today. So shall we go on to Oxford?
Yes, exactly, great. Oxford with folio 18, specifically the Ashmolean.
Yes. So I'm gonna start sharing. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Henrike. So as Eric said, this is the only leaf we have in Oxford in the Ashmolean, coming from the collection of Francis Dowse. And Francis Dowse was quite an eccentric collector. I can't tell you too much about him today, but do look him up, as I think he's one of the most fascinating figures, as Henrike and my colleagues at the Bodleian, Alexandra is here today, will agree. And so Dowse was originally destined to become an attorney, but from very early on, he was just obsessed with books, to the great, great disappointment of his father and his brother. But he had the means to collect lots of books, and particularly medieval manuscripts, printed books, but also single leaf and loose prints. He even, because of his great expertise in the material, he was made a curator at the British Museum in London in 1807. Dowse was born in 1757, so he was already 50 years old by that time, so quite a late appointment. And it was very clear very quickly that he just couldn't sort of settle into an institutional job. And so there's lots of documentation about how he had lots of arguments with the trustees and his colleagues at the British Museum. And after 4 years, he resigned, and his resignation letter is one of the funniest things I've ever read. And so do look it up. And having worked at the British Museum until 6 years ago, I must admit not much has changed since Dowse's time and his resignation letter. But so some of his interests in his collection were the divine, the macabre, the dance of death, devils, but also English literature, Shakespeare, for instance. And his collection really spans everything from the 15th century until the time of his death, 1834. His great passion was Northern prints and Northern books. So there's a lot of Flemish, there's a lot of German material in particular, but also contemporary British wood engravings from contemporary newspapers, for instance. And the reason why Dowse bought, and as Eric already said, we don't really know where Dowse got his print from directly. The reason why Dowse was interested in this print is, of course, because of the presence of the skeleton, because that's his great passion in his collection, the Dance of Death. So he might not have known it was from the Ackermann, but his main interest was death seated on the throne, and that's why it fitted so perfectly in his collection. I'm quite, if Eric can interject, I'm quite interested in the inscription in the top right corner. If you can expand on that, that would hugely interest me, but it might be too difficult for now.
Just at the very top, I think that's just a Roman numeral, and
it looks like, maybe I can zoom in. Shall I?
It should be a Roman numeral, and it should be the chapter, not the leaf. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're getting an XV and a number of I's. I forget your leaf, what, 18? So I think you're on leaf 18. So XVIII.
Oh, brilliant.
Is what you're seeing there.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah.
I shall amend our database.
All right.
So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Is there any, I forget, is there any kind of catchword at the bottom? I forget. Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't.
Let me stop. Let me do it again.
There's more over there if he's on the bottom of the cart.
Probably not.
Nope.
No.
Maybe the other side. But are you mounted at the top?
We're on.
Oh, that's where it might be. Yeah. You would be at the right side, top to bottom, but we could look at photos later. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see anything.
You can actually see the same foliation in our copy here at the top.
Yeah.
So that's just the same hand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very interesting.
The next folio I have on my list is folio 20. And
That sounds like Princeton's. I don't have a visualizer here. I will show you the volume like this. Very nice binding. Ackermann von Böhmen, Albrecht Pfister, Bamberg. It says 1460. And book plates of Bent Jule Jensen, and then the Scheide Library. An inscription in pencil, very hard to read, but a little bit of description of how the Ackermann and Pfister in general are so rare. Mentions great works at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel, the Spencer Library, et cetera, and H.B. Krauss stories from a rare book saga, sort of what the collector would be interested in. And then again, I found this by chance among a lot of old pamphlets and bought it. It remains a black tulip among incunables. So that's very nice. And again, this came to Mr. Scheide through Quaritch and Richard Linenthal. And the leaf is here. It's mounted in, so I can turn it. It's pretty well shown. The recto is actually missing text on the, so the mounting and trimming lost a few letters, but we too have the numbers at the top. And the watermark that I showed, the bull's head watermark. Yeah. Next.
So shall we go to the Wolfenbüttel copy?
No, I think we have.
Juliana's next.
Sorry.
Manchester, and then Wolfenbüttel.
Okay. So this is just the single leaf, and that Eric has just shown you the watermark from this. It's too difficult to show you that live to get the light underneath. But I have to add a correction, Eric, which I think you've had in notes previously that you'd sent to me. But this isn't from the Spencer collection. It's from Hero van Holtop.
Really? Super. That's better to know.
Yeah. So it circulated for, I don't know, a century or so before Mrs. Rylands purchased a Holtop collection, which was of early specimens of printing, single leaves, such as this, in 1906.
It's so much better. It's so much better. It makes sense. And yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Why it's loose. But the confusing thing is the number that's been added to the top. So this is something that we started looking into at the beginning of 2020 when looking at the Holtop collection. And an early librarian, probably Henry Guppy, in the early 20th century, removed some of these, let's guess, what they considered the most significant examples from the Holtop collection, and gave them these Spencer numbers and sort of added them to the Spencer collection, which has added confusion on top of everything else. But it does have that note, also the note at the bottom. A note on the leaf.
Yeah, a leaf of Albrecht Pfister's Book of Bamberg, about 1461.
And then if we move to the other copy, which is from the Spencer collection, but purchased slightly later, bound, in fact, with the Latin Pfister Bibliopauperum, but inserted into this note from 1799 on printing in Bamberg by Camus. So there's the leaf inserted into that work in reverse.
Right.
So there would.
What's fascinating about that leaf is that the eyes of the death are pierced through. So somebody stabbed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
if I move that, you can sort of see possibly the hole there.
Yeah.
Quite appropriate for Halloween.
And the text. So also get that now into the shot. Just cropped off at the top too. Okay, but I'm handing over to someone else. Or?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I think these sneak peeks of the woodcuts lead us nicely to the final bit. We'll have a look at the 5 woodcuts in the Wolfenbüttel copy, which we can sadly only see here, but therefore we have great quality. And I'll just very briefly take you through the 5 woodcuts because they are really very nice before closing off the session. So this first woodcut basically just sets out the basic rhetorical structure of the text as a Krieg, or a war. So on the right-hand side, we see Margaret, the deceased wife. Then we see the Ackermann with his children, which are only mentioned, I think, in chapter 13. So this is the very first leaf of the Ackermann, and then the text follows. And then we see Death, of course, on a throne in the middle. When we then move on to the second woodcut, we see fairly similar arrangement. Once again, Death is sat on a throne, and the Ackermann stands in front of him. And the second woodcut coincides with a break in content. So the first 5 chapters introduce the point of contention, so the death of the Ackermann's wife. And it's here marked by this woodcut that the proper disputation actually starts. And there are a few details. So we see the Pope, a king, and 2 noblemen in the bottom left corner, which expands on a reference to the Pope in the text. So really the woodcuts elaborate on details in the text, going beyond what is strictly on the textual level. If we now move on to the third woodcut, we see this is in the middle of the Ackermann, and this can really be considered the center of the text, as it negotiates the nature of death, here represented not as one entity but 2. And in the text, this has quite a nice correspondence. So Death says, du fragest, was wir sein nichts und sein doch etwas. So you, the Ackermann, asks who or what we are. We are nothing, but still are something. So yeah, this nature of death, lacking personality or corporality, is highlighted really nicely in this woodcut with multiple deaths. Then the fourth woodcut appears towards the end of the text. And here the disputation has moved on from an argument as such, and instead now the Ackermann asks Death what his advice would be for the Ackermann's future. So now that he's lost his wife, what should he do? Should he try to seek out a new family, new wife, or should he consecrate his life to Christ? And we can see the two options in the bottom half of the woodcut. On the right hand side, a family under a tree bearing fruit, and then on the other side, monks walking out of a chapel. And then to close off the session, the fifth woodcut, which marks the end of the disputation, with God's judgment. So we can see the hierarchies have been corrected. Death and Ackermann now stand on the same level, with God or Christ sitting on a cloud, judging. Exactly. So with this final beautiful woodcut, I would hand over to Bettina for a few closing words.
Well, there's very little I can add. We've had an afternoon full of amazing insights. We've learned a lot about what kinds of texts Pfister produced in Bamberg, how he illustrated his books, and particularly how they were distributed, how they arrived in the collections where they are today. I can only thank everybody again for having made this possible. I've always dreamed of an exhibition on Pfister in Bamberg, but this has been far better, I think. We've seen a lot in close detail and had wonderful expert comments on it. I would invite final questions if people still have a little bit of time, so we can activate the microphones and videos. If you just post questions in the chat or say that you want to ask a question, I will call you up.
Bettina, I did have a 5-minute section on the Pfisters. Should we
go over that?
Sorry,
that was the 4 histories. Yeah.
Could we? I could do it very quickly, or should we skip
very
it?
Quickly? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I'll try it.
Yeah.
I think I can get. What are you seeing? Anything?
Nothing. Only you.
Okay. If I'm having technical troubles, then let's skip it. I'll. Yeah, somehow it's not showing up where I thought it would. Here, let's see. This, I would like to show this very quickly. Is that visible to everyone?
No.
Not sharing, okay. Let me try again. And if this doesn't work, we'll just skip it.
Oh yes, no, yeah.
Okay, I can, my apologies, I can be very quick here.
Yeah.
Slideshow and play from start. We haven't been able to look at the other Vier Historien or the Sammelband that it belongs to, that's in Paris. I just had a quick note on its provenance that came out recently. This Sammelband was also discovered in 1792, but not in Würzburg. It was in Augsburg. Matthias Jakob Adam Steiner of the Church of Ulrich and Afra mentioned it, and it entered the literature in 1792. But that's been the provenance, that Steiner saw it in Augsburg, and soon enough it was in Paris. Here is Steiner, and here's where he published it in 1792. But I don't think we knew that in the Oberdeutsche Allgemeine Literaturzeitung of 1800, there was a review of Steiner that mentioned a little bit more about the provenance, that Steiner saw it in the collection of his late friend, the Apotheker Michels in Augsburg. Well, who is that? Michels here, Johann Christian Michel, was an apothecary, a noted one in Augsburg, and he had a book sale. He had a book sale in 1799, in which lot 127 was 3 tractates. And you can see here that it's talking about the complaint against death, 24 leaves and 5 woodcuts, a biblical storybook that has stories of Joseph, Daniel, Esther, and Judith, and then also a Bibliopauperum in Deutsch. And this was sold in 1799 in Augsburg. So here is more of its provenance, and I can share this information with anyone who is interested. There is the entry. I'm happy to share this. This is a published online thing. In the copy in Paris is this inscription, which has gotten some attention in terms of its provenance. Basically, the Apostles' Creed written out in nice penmanship, and then the name Johann Jeremias Lutz and the date 1740. I don't believe it's provenance. I believe it's just writing the Apostles' Creed into the book. But remember that name, Johann Jeremias Lutz, because it turns up in an Augsburg context in this book on early printing, which is Augsburgische Kinderreden. So schoolboys talking about the invention of printing in the third Jubilee in 1740. One of these speakers who has a part in this Jubilee Fest, number 20, is Johann Jeremias Lutz, a schoolboy. And that's what I think the inscription is, the inscription of a schoolboy. Johann Jeremias Lutz recited his story from the history of printing, and so did another schoolboy, Johann Christian Michel, the future apothecary and owner of the book in Augsburg. So these two schoolboys knew about the book in school, and one of them later in life becomes the owner, and then it's discovered in 1792 and sold in 1799. Where were these boys in school? They were at the St. Anna Gymnasium in Augsburg, which was all of its books, I believe, formerly belonged, and we'll need expertise from Augsburg on this. I believe its books formerly belonged to the Carmelite cluster. Its site, founded in this gymnasium was founded in 1531 on the site of the Carmelite cluster. So I think that gives us more of the Augsburg provenance, and perhaps takes us back to the Carmelites in Augsburg as a likely story for this Pfisters Sammelband. Thanks.
That's fascinating. I tried for my paper on the Vier Historien also to locate Lutz, and I found a different Lutz earlier, who was one of the goldsmiths.
Me too.
Yeah, but it makes much more sense to have the schoolboy entry. So the goldsmith is attested
quite a bit older and no
1736, but
no known connection to early printing, I think. And then so it's the right name, and not so I think we can look towards these two boys and the apothecary Michels, and then we have a book sale.
Were you able to make anything of the coat of arms, which is at the end with a wild woman?
Right, Gott nimmt und gibt.
Yeah.
Or gibt it, yeah.
Gott gibt's und nimmt's, yeah.
I have not. That's biblical, I think. So
it's true, but
yeah. So more work in Augsburg would be great. Yeah, thank you.